So, this was originally going to be a 3-part series. However, after seeing a lot of discussion about this in places such as Codabus, working with cloud for a living, and this Reddit post made by someone completely unaware of the circumstances, and instead just went full tech bro, use cloud, it's better! Here we are. Before I get into the economics of why cloud doesn't make a shred of sense for SS13 hosting, I want to give some background on the reasons where cloud can make sense. When I say cloud, I mean managed service providers like AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, Oracle Cloud, etc. Cloud is designed for traditional server offerings, which is what most people in a business need. Being able to rapidly scale out hundreds of cores is very appealing for a business. Meanwhile, Beyond only uses one thread for proc execution, and that thread needs to be incredibly fast, as you have probably learned from the other parts in this series, which essentially rules out Intel Xeon, AMD EPYC, and other traditional offerings. I do not know of a single cloud provider that stocks standard desktop chips that we use, such as the 14900K. The other main selling point for cloud is software as a service offerings, commonly shortened to SaaS. SaaS works great for databases and the like, where it's standard software with a standard protocol. They take the hardware and OS management out of the equation and just provide you with a running service. Need more performance? Crank a slider and speak to your financial team for whether the budget has it. If you were running traditionally and using on-prem servers, you would have to scope out a server upgrade, migration time, ongoing maintenance, patching, and all the other shenanigans involved. Whereas with cloud, all of that is on the responsibility of the provider. You just go to Azure, for example, and say, hey, I need a database that can handle a fuck ton of IOPS and 4 terabytes of storage. Here's the money we saved by not giving our staff freedom. And they go, okay, here's your server, in a matter of seconds. Go figure, this is for industry standard things like databases or web apps with common frameworks, aka things that exist in the mainstream. You ain't gonna get SaaS Beyond anytime soon, even with systems like TGS. There's just no incentive for a cloud provider to manage it. With that out of the way, let's get into why the economics of cloud don't make any sense for an SS13 hosting operation. For this, I will be using Azure because it is what I am most familiar with, having worked with it on a daily basis for the past 2 years. However, the cost will be within the same order of magnitude if you used AWS or Google Cloud or anything else really. Remember, our core, single server that runs all of this has a 14900K, 192 gigs of RAM, 2 4TB NVMe drives, 10 gigabit WAN, and that costs us $201 a month. Let's just stick this in the corner here so you have a reminder as the insanity continues. Now, despite being in the nation whose biggest export is Independence Days, I will stick with US dollars as most of you lot are American, and it keeps things simpler by not having to do currency conversions. The planned deployment will be to match the Paradise architecture. To be clear, just the main server for now. The relays won't be necessary just to prove how outlandishly stupid this is. I will match things as close as I can, however I will take some liberties where I can to fully take advantage of all the cloud offerings. As while I could do all of this with a pile of Azure VMs, one of the main reasons of going to cloud is to take advantage of the managed offerings. To start with, let's take the game server at Paradise. Remember, this has 8 cores and 16 gigs of RAM, and 512 gigs of storage, and most importantly, blistering single thread speed. Trying to find the Azure VM with the fastest single thread speed is easier said than done, and I wasn't about to mortgage my house to test all of this, so we'll be going off research. The common answer is that the Azure FX series has the highest single thread speed. And here we can see our first problem. You can't perfectly pick however much RAM and CPU you want. They're done to fixed sizes. So either take 4 cores and 84 gigs of RAM, or 12 cores and an absolutely ludicrous 252 gigs of RAM. Given we can actually benefit from the extra cores now, we will go for that, and also apply the spending commitment given the server will be a continuous spend. As you can see with only the game server applied, we are already at a whopping $965.09 a month. And no, that does not include storage or bandwidth. And keep in mind, this is just for the base VM. I still have to handle all the management and everything else on here. This is just Azure giving me a blank VM. Now we add our 512GB SSD. Only $73.22 a month? Bargain! Our monthly cost is now only $1,038.31 a month. Also, you'll notice, like I said before, you have to pay separately for bandwidth, but I will get to that later for a very important reason. Now we handle our databases. Yes, plural. At Paradise, we have about 10 databases that we consistently use. Billing each of these separately on Azure wouldn't give us any management benefit, so it makes sense to get an entire MySQL instance. And remember, it needs to be MySQL. We cannot use Microsoft SQL here because nothing we have is written for it. For this, we will use Azure Database for MySQL, the fully managed and scalable MySQL database. To give us 4 vCores of performance, on par with the existing DB VM, that costs $249.66 per month. Just for compute. Now we add storage, which thankfully isn't much, as SS13, the forums, and everything else is pretty light on storage. We only actually use 11.6 gigs in the database server, so we'll future-proof this a tiny bit and allocate 16 gigs of storage to the database, which will cost us a measly $1.84 a month. However, there's another component to this, the IOPS, which is essentially how much reading and writing is done to the database. Truth be told, I have zero fucking clue how many IOPS our database handles, so I'm just going to estimate 1 million IOPS a day, 31 million a month unless you're picky, which costs us $7.75 a month, bringing our database total per month in at $260.80. However, we can get that down to $149.68 a month if we opt for the yearly commitment. Again, just the database alone, without savings, is already more expensive than the full server we already pay for. Now for the web apps. Paradise runs 2 primary web apps, the forums and the wiki, as well as a bunch of custom tooling. We could be sensible and go the VM approach with a super cheap VM that has 2 cores, 4 gigs of RAM, and 128 gigs of storage. That would bill us $75.52 a month, or $54.17 a month if we apply the cost savings. But that's not cloud enough. We can go container pilled! And get a container with PHP pre-installed for the web server. Given we won't be running the rest of the OS, we can provision a 24/7 container with 2 gigs of RAM and 1 core for $36.06 a month, coming down to $26.33 a month if we opt for yearly commitment savings. This, however, comes at the cost of needing dedicated storage for the container. This will bill us $20.48 a month. Note that this comes to $46.81 a month, which is almost as much as the VM with cost savings, not to mention the VM has double the cores and RAM, and the VM is a full VM, not just an Apache container and storage. Are you starting to see why this doesn't make sense yet? Now for the API. Most of you won't have used it, or even be aware of it, but Paradise has a public API to pull round stats and profiler information from. Given it's an ASP.NET Core Web API, we can run this on Azure App Service, and given how little volume it has, we can use the cheapest plan available, which is $13.14 a month. The same service runner can also run our internal API that we use for 2FA and other things like that. Both are incredibly lightweight, so it can all fit on one service runner. Now let's take the rest of the stuff running on the core server. Aside from the database, this includes the Discord bot, also known as Alice, the proxy daemon, the profiler ingest daemon, the profiler cleanup utility, the IP to ASN service, the PR label bot, the form utility system, and the forum rank monitor system. You don't need to know what these are, just that they exist. The good news is, with the exception of Alice, all of these can be rewritten to Azure Functions, which have a pretty decent free tier. So given our limits would likely be within those, let's just call it $0 a month for the miscellaneous core server stuff, and a 1 core 1 gig container for Alice, running to $32.81 a month, with $23.95 a month if we opt for cost savings. Now for the Elasticsearch stuff. As I showed in the previous episode, Paradise has a pretty hefty Elasticsearch system, with the machine having 4 cores, 24 gigs of RAM, and 320 gigs of storage. I can't actually calculate the prices for this on the Azure calculator, you have to use Elasticsearch's own calculator. The closest spec I can find is 2 cores, 8 gigs of RAM, and 280 gigs of storage, as the next one up is 2 cores, 16 gigs of RAM, and 525 gigs of storage. This costs us $0.2416 an hour at the cheapest license tier, which is standard. We then have to separately price Kibana, which is the viewer for the logs. If we get the cheapest plan, which is 1 gig of RAM and up to 8.5 cores, which, side note, what in the fuck? Anyway, this has a free hourly rate, which means our only hourly rate is the one for Elasticsearch. However, when we get the monthly rate by multiplying it by 730, we get $176.37 per month. Before I go into the total, and the big kicker, let's just go over a list of things not included and why. The first major omission is the internal GitLab, because that's just another small VM, and honestly I've been debating ditching it, it's a massive pain. Not to mention, I think I have enough here to make my point. The next major omission is the on-site backup, because everything here would use Azure Backup, which I've factored in locally redundant storage into each line item here, giving us protection from local disk failures and everything else up to the point of a data center burning down like what happened to OVH a few years back. Other omissions include the PRTG monitoring server, as Azure has enough dashboards and insights for everything else related to that, and Korn stat server, because I would make that his problem to solve. Now, remember before when I said you have to pay for bandwidth separately? This is where the costs really fall apart. Paradise uses about 5.5 terabytes of outbound bandwidth per month. If we add that on, our bandwidth alone costs us $469.80 per month. With that all in, our total is now $1,752.83 per month. With that much money, I could build the server outright and fly to New York to install it. Like I said at the start, cloud does not make sense for SS13 servers. Cloud is good for people who don't want to manage their own infrastructure, or where time is more important than money, two qualities valued highly by businesses. They don't care about burning this much money per month if it means not paying a dedicated server admin just for the database server. Cloud can work for SS13 adjacent things. I myself use it to host the web map, as well as the images for MapDiffBot. And despite MDB holding 950 gigabytes of images, since, well, there's 1.23 million of them, my monthly Azure bill is less than 20 quid per month. Either way, this is why cloud does not work at all for hosting SS13 servers. We don't have the budget or the need for it. This should hopefully be the last part in the SS13 hosting series, but that's not to say a mysterious part 5 won't appear one day. I don't have plans for one, but I also didn't have plans for this episode, so things could easily change. Anyway, see ya.